In this lecture, we discuss about thoracic cavity and the respiratory system. We have discussed about thoracic cavity to some extent in the lab session. So as a reminder, let me remind you about the thoracic cage, osteology of thoracic cage. So the boundaries of the thoracic cavity, anteriorly, we have the sternum and the cartilages, which connects the ribs and the sternum. This is called chondral cartilages. So anterior boundary is made of the sternum and the chondral cartilages on each side. Lateral boundary is made of the ribs. We have 12 ribs, first to 12 on the right and another 12 on the left side. And the posterior boundary of the thoracic cavity is made of the spinal column, the vertebrae, and the intervertebral disc, and some part of the ribs here. The superior boundary of the thoracic cavity is made of the first rib, as you can see here on either side, and inferior boundary is made of right and left dome of the diaphragm. Diaphragm is the fibromuscular structure which divides the thoracic and the abdominal cavity here. Again, like sternum is made of three portions: the top manubrium sternum, the body of the sternum, and the sternum. So let's talk about respiratory system. Respiratory system can be divided into upper and lower respiratory system. So if we look at in this diagram, the nasal cavity, which is inside our nose, and there are air-filled cavities which are on either side of the nasal cavities. These are called nasal sinuses. So nasal cavity, nasal sinuses, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, which we divide into right main bronchus and left main bronchus, which enters into the lungs. And these main bronchus we further divide into smaller and smaller bronchi. And finally, they become very small, which are called bronchioles. And finally, these we end up as the alveoli, which are small little airfilled sacs that's inside the lungs. And the same thing like the heart, because the heart was covered with the pericardium. The lungs are covered with the pleura. So pleura, we have two layers of pleura. One layer of pleura is lining the thoracic cavity, and another layer is visceral layer, which covers immediately to the lung substances. So the layer in between these parietal and visceral layer is called the pleural space. So it is just a potential space which is filled with pleura, small amount of flimsy pleural fluid. So now we have seen the whole respiratory tract, and there is a division between upper and lower respiratory tract, because this is a very common term like upper respiratory tract infection or lower respiratory tract infection. Where is the cutoff point between upper and lower respiratory tract region? It is at the level of larynx. Part of the larynx will be included in the upper respiratory tract, but the main portion of the larynx will be included in the lower respiratory tract. And that point of division for upper and lower respiratory tract is the vocal cord. So we will go and study about the larynx anatomy. We identify the vocal cord, and anything above, any portion of the larynx above the vocal cord will be in the upper respiratory tract. So this is the upper respiratory tract, and this is the lower respiratory tract. And I want to remind you again, larynx is both in the upper and lower respiratory tract. The portion of the larynx, which is called vocal fold, that line defines the upper and lower respiratory tract. So now let's look at our nose, because the nose is the only structure which we can see from outside of the respiratory system. So the nose is made of the bony portion and the cartilaginous portion. The bony portion comes from the nasal bone here. And if you look at the cartilage portion, which is like a major alar cartilage, that is the hyaline cartilage. But if you look at this here, which is called in anatomical term, alar of the nose, which is colored with white, it is made of dense fibrous connective tissue. And this major alar cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage. So now this is the sagittal section of the upper respiratory tract, which start with the nostril, which is the entrance into the nasal cavity. And the air we breathe in, we enter into the nasal cavity through the nostril, and then that we leave the nasal cavity and enter into the structure which is posterior to the nasal cavity, that is called nasopharynx. The division is the aperture, posterior nasal aperture. So now the air we get into the nasopharynx. Nasopharynx is the part of the pharynx. The pharynx is made of nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. Portion of the pharynx posterior to the nasal cavity is called nasopharynx. Portion of the pharynx posterior to the oral cavity is called oropharynx. And the portion of the pharynx just immediately above the larynx is called laryngopharynx. So the air we breathe in, we come into the nasal cavity. And if you look at the nasal cavity, we have a dome curvature structures in the nasal cavity. These are called nasal concave. Of course, if we look from the anterior, frontal view or coronal view, we see much better. So now we have three nasal concave, superior, middle, and inferior nasal concave. In between the nasal concave, we have grooves, which are called nasal meatus. So superior nasal meatus, middle nasal meatus, and inferior nasal meatus here. Now let's look at this diagram more carefully. The superior boundary of the nasal cavity will be the ethmoid bone here and the sphenoid bone here. Inferior boundary of the nasal cavity will be the hard palate, which is the roof of the mouth or a cavity, and that extends a soft tissue, which is called soft palate, and finally turn down into uvula. So these are the boundaries of the nasal cavity. So just looking in the cadaver, like superior nasal concave, middle nasal concave, and inferior nasal concave, and the superior, middle, and inferior nasal meatus. And if you look a bit more carefully, there is an opening here at the entrance, at the junction of the nasal cavity and nasopharynx, which is called auditory tube, which is also called pharyngotympanic tube. Pharyngo means pharynx, tympanic means ear cavity. So this tube will connect the pharynx and the ear cavity. And just above the auditory tube or pharyngotympanic tube, we have the tubal tonsil. So now this is the coronal section and the landmarks, of course, orbital cavities, right eye and left eye. And this is our nasal cavity. Nasal cavity is divided into right and left nasal cavity by the nasal septum here. And you can see the nasal concave, which are arising from the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, coming medially, and they are carved here. These are called nasal concaves. Because of these curvature, it increases the surface area, and the job of the nasal cavity is to warm the air, to trap the air, to filter the air, and therefore it makes the space more efficient. So now I hope this slide is no longer difficult for you. The only thing to remember from this slide is nasal cavity is lined by the pseudo-stratifying columnar ciliated epithelium. Pseudo-stratifying columnar ciliated epithelium, which is rich with blood vessels and nerve. Therefore, nasal cavity is very sensitive and it can bleed easily because it has got very rich blood supply. And I was talking about the paranasal sinuses. Paranasal sinuses, these are the air-filled structure cavities which are on either side of the nose. And they are located in the ethmoid bone, sphenoid bone, frontal bone, and maxillary bone. And therefore, they are called ethmoid air sinus, sphenoid air sinus, frontal air sinus, and maxillary air sinus. Their job is number one, for insulation and to buffer against the forces to lighten the head and face and cranial cavity, increase the resonance of the voice, and it also humidify and heat the inhaled air. So these are the paranasal sinuses. So if you look at the maxillary sinus in the maxillary bone, frontal sinus in the frontal bone, at the root of the nose, you can see the ethmoid air sinus and sphenoid sinus, which is just around here, but it is more posterior. So these are the nasal sinuses which are present around the nose. And now, if you look from the sagittal view, you can see the maxillary sinus, and you can see better with the sphenoid air sinuses. So what are these clinical importance of this? I hope you can remember the sinusitis. Sinusitis is the inflammation of the nasal air sinuses. So let's say maxillary sinusitis means there is an inflammation in the maxillary air sinuses. So after the nasal cavity, the air we breathe in, we enter into the nasopharynx, then go into the oropharynx, and finally it has to go into the laryngopharynx. So if you think about that, in the laryngopharynx, the food we swallow and the air we breathe in will be together in the laryngopharynx. So laryngopharynx is the portion of the pharynx which we divide and divert the food into the esophagus and the air into the larynx, which is more anteriorly here. So pharynx is formed of nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. The pharynx extends from the base of the skull to the 6 cervical vertebra. So pharynx, nasopharynx start from the base of the skull to the uvula and soft palate. Of course, that will form the upper boundary of the oropharynx, soft palate, and it will down to the epiglottis. Epiglottis is part of the larynx, which we make the boundary of the oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, which is the common passage for the food and air. The important structures related in the pharynx, these are the tonsils. Tonsils are the lymphoid tissue, lymphoid organs. In the nasopharynx, we have pharyngeal tonsil and tubal tonsil. In the oropharynx, we have palatine tonsil and lingual tonsil. Of course, it is oral, therefore it is related to the tongue, therefore we have lingual tonsil. And it is related to the palate, and therefore we have palatine tonsil. I'm going to stop here. I want you to take a break. I want you to go back to previous slide and make sure you understand before we continue any further.